Okay, so just look around you next time you're out. I mean, how many people do you see wearing something on their wrist, or maybe a ring, that tracks steps or checks their sleep, maybe even gives them like a stress score?
Oh, absolutely. It feels like it's everywhere now, doesn't it?
It really does. This tech, it's not just for, elite athletes anymore. It's on our wrists, it's in our pockets. I've even seen it woven into clothes.
That's spot on. What we're really seeing is this dramatic surge, really, in consumer technology that's just readily available. And it's designed to evaluate pretty much everything, right? From our physical status or psychological state.
Performance tracking.
Yeah, performance tracking, even helping us cultivate emotional awareness or understand our cognitive function better is a huge range.
It's not like the old clunky tech either. It feels like it's getting exponentially smarter.
Definitely. We're talking about a significant shift, moving way beyond just simple counting, like step counts, or getting insights based on these very static general population averages.
Right, like the average person needs X.
Exactly. We're moving towards these incredibly miniaturized sensors, packed with real computing power. They're integrating artificial intelligence to process really complex signals. And the big promise is this idea of real-time, highly personalized feedback, like a loop.
Yeah, feedback loops. That makes sense.
And this whole intersection, technology and human data, it really falls under the umbrella of wearable health and performance tech. And it connects really deeply with the whole field of biofeedback.
Biofeedback. Okay.
The promise is genuinely transformative, I think, unlocking these personalized insights into how our bodies and minds actually work in ways we just couldn't easily access before.
But, with that incredible promise, there's always a but, isn't there? There's this crucial question, and it feels often overlooked. What does the science actually say? What can these devices really do?
How accurate are they?
Yeah, how accurate are the measurements? How well do they actually perform the functions they claim to? And maybe most importantly, where is this field genuinely heading based on, solid evidence, not just hype?
That is precisely our mission for this deep dive. We've gathered a whole stack of sources here. Comprehensive research reviews, some detailed market reports, specific clinical studies, and we're going to try and systematically unpack the current state of wearable tech, how biofeedback principles fit in, and that absolutely fundamental question, validation.
Validation. That seems key.
It's crucial, what's actually been put to the test and proven. What looks really promising, but, maybe needs more digging, more evidence,
Right.
and what's still largely just an unknown quantity.
Okay, so we're going to explore the sheer breadth of these devices, right? Looking into what they claim to do. I mean, everything from tracking stress and sleep to actually assisting in physical rehab or even helping with objective evaluation of things like concussions.
Wow, okay. And we'll peel back the layers on the tech itself, the sensors.
Yep, the underlying sensor technology will definitely confront the importance and, frankly, the frequent absence of independent scientific validation. And we'll also take a look at the booming market landscape that's pushing all this forward. So this is way more than just, counting your steps on a morning run.
Oh, much more. It's really about understanding technology that could fundamentally change how we monitor health, how we intervene, and crucially, figuring out what's real, what's grounded in solid evidence versus what's still just kind of emerging or maybe even just wishful thinking.
Okay, let's really unpack this exploding landscape first then. Because the scale of it really is staggering. The sheer availability of these consumer gadgets for evaluating physical health, psychological health.
Enhancing emotional awareness, monitoring sleep, assessing cognitive function.
Yeah, all of it. It's just, it feels like it's increased dramatically, almost overwhelmingly, just in the last few years.
It really is a transformative shift. And like you said, we've moved well beyond just basic vital sign telemetry, just sending a heart rate number off somewhere or relying only on that static population level data to make these broad guesses about individuals.
Right. The tech itself is getting so much more sophisticated and integrated.
Exactly. Think about the evolution. Sensors that, used to be confined to big medical labs are now tiny enough to fit on a little wristband or even a smart ring. They're paired with integrated computing power, processing signals right there on the device. And increasingly, they're using AI, artificial intelligence algorithms, to try and make sense of complex data patterns. The goal is definitely to make the technology smarter.
More personalized, maybe.
More personalized, and ideally, delivering that feedback in real time. That's the big aim.
What's really interesting, though, and you picked up on this from the sources, is that while the tech development itself building the tiny sensors, making the hardware work that's often been driven by bioengineers, getting to truly effective and validated real-world use. That needs a much broader team, doesn't it? It's interdisciplinary.
Absolutely. To really understand what the signals mean, to process that flood of data into something useful, and then to validate it, to check it's accurately capturing reality, you absolutely need collaboration.
So who else needs to be involved?
Well, you need mathematicians, computer scientists for the complex algorithms, and critically, you need physiologists, medical experts, people who can interpret what those biological signals actually represent and confirm the tech's accuracy against, established biological markers or gold standard measurements.
It's a real interplay of different fields then. And one of the research reviews we looked at, it gave a pretty useful way to think about this diverse landscape. It grouped the technologies into broad categories.
Right. What were those categories again?
Let's see. They had devices for monitoring hydration status and metabolism. Then devices, garments, apps for monitoring physical and psychological stress. Wearables, they give physical biofeedback, like muscle stimulation or haptic feedback.
Haptic, like touch-based feedback.
Yeah, exactly. Then devices for cognitive feedback and training. Technology specifically for monitoring and promoting sleep. And a whole category just for devices and apps for evaluating concussion.
Wow, okay. That spectrum alone just shows how widely this tech is spreading, doesn't it?
It really does. It gives us a kind of map for this deep dive.
And the reviewers who put that list together, how did they approach it? Did they just list everything?
No, they were pretty systematic. They searched the internet, databases like PubMed, using keywords for each category.
Yeah.
Wearable technology, hydration, biofeedback, sleep analysis, concussion, things like that.
Okay.
And they didn't just list them. They actually went to the company websites, specifically looking for any links to published research or evidence of validation.
Ah, looking for proof.
Exactly. And if they found potential leads, they dug into the scientific literature. Then they evaluated the tech based on some key things. What it claimed to do, was there any independent validation? How reliable were the measurements? Did it need calibration or specialist knowledge? And was it actually available to buy?
Right. So it wasn't just a random list.
No, not at all. But they did say it wasn't meant to be exhaustive. The market changes so fast. It was more like a cross-sectional summary, a snapshot of the types of tech, and really importantly, the state of the evidence supporting them at that particular time.
And that snapshot, I bet it revealed some interesting patterns.
Oh, yeah. Let's dive into some of those specific areas and see what the sources actually said, starting with hydration status and metabolism. So monitoring things like how hydrated you are or how your muscles are using oxygen. We are seeing wearable and portable devices being developed for this.
Okay. But what really jumps out from that review, even in this very specific area focused on, core body processes, is that very few of the devices they found had actually gone through rigorous, independent validation for accuracy and reliability.
That sounds familiar already. Feels like a theme emerging.
It does, but they did mention some specifics. Devices like the Moxie, which measures oxygen saturation in skeletal muscle, and another called Portamon, measuring different types of hemoglobin in muscle tissue, oxy-deoxy, total hemoglobin.
And these are based on NIRS, right?
Yeah.
Near-infrared spectroscopy.
That's right, NIRS. It's a scientific technique, uses light in the near-infrared range to estimate blood flow and oxygenation in tissues.
Okay, so there's a scientific principle behind it. Was there any validation mentioned for those specific devices?
Well, yes. For Portamon, there was some validation mentioned. It's been validated against something called phosphorus magnetic resonance spectroscopy, 31 PMRS.
Okay, 31 PMRS sounds complex.
It is. It's a high-tech method used in research labs to look at muscle metabolism non-invasively. So validating against that is actually a pretty significant step.
Right, comparing it against a more established, even if it's lab-based method.
Exactly. And the sources also mentioned a similar device from the same company, the Oxymon. That one showed reliable measurements of muscle oxygen consumption with about 2.4% variation at rest, maybe 10% after exercise. It also showed decent reliability for measuring resting oxygen levels in the brain, though the variation was a bit higher there, like 12.5% short-term, 15% long-term.
Okay, so those are specific numbers suggesting some level of reliability testing was done.
They are valuable details for those specific devices, absolutely. But the limitations are also really important to note. Interpreting the data from these NRS devices, it often requires some real expertise, not just, casual knowledge. And even between devices based on the same NRS principles, the data they spit out can vary. So, yeah, some progress on validation there, but they're not necessarily simple tools for anyone to just pick up and use without understanding the nuances.
Okay. Let's shift to training loads, movement patterns, injury risks. This feels like the biggest category, doesn't it?
Right.
The stuff you attach, wearing clothes, putting your shoes, or just use apps on your phone.
Oh, it's a massive and really diverse category, and a lot of these rely heavily on accelerometers and gyroscopes.
Yeah, the same tiny sensors that figure out which way up your phone is
Yeah.
or track movement.
Exactly the same ones. They can track basic things like body position, velocity, but they can also be used to calculate metrics like jump height, force produced, power output during a movement, total work done, even rotational movements.
And that kind of data is gold for biomechanists, ergonomists.
Definitely. They use it to analyze how people move, spot potential risks for fatigue or injury, help athletes tweak their technique, or workers adjust their movements.
And then you have the mobile apps and platforms. These either pull data from sensors or just rely on you manually typing in how you feel, what you did.
Right. The review listed several examples here, things like Conduct, Metrofit, Athlete Monitoring, SportsMed Elite, Smartabase.
Okay, quite a few. And what was the pattern with these apps, the ones focused on training load, recovery, injury risk? Was the validation picture any better?
Well, this is where that recurring theme really hits home. What's truly notable from the review's findings for this entire group of applications is a clear, widespread lack of stated independent validation or reliability testing.
For most of them.
For most of them, according to the sources. So while they offer really sophisticated features analyzing data, predicting risk, showing fancy dashboards, incorporating questionnaires about mood, sleep, stress, muscle soreness, readiness,
Cracking injuries, integrating with other devices.
all of that, the critical piece, the published independent evidence that actually confirms the accuracy or the reliability of the numbers they're showing you or the insights they're generating, that was largely absent, according to this review,
Wow, so the functionality looks great on the surface, but the proof behind it.
is often missing or just not publicly available, which makes it incredibly challenging for the user, whether that's an athlete, a coach, or just someone trying to manage their own fitness. How do you assess the validity of the insights you're getting?
Yeah. And the review noted that many of these apps track similar things anyway.
Right, so the choice often comes down to usability, specific features you like, or maybe just personal preference, rather than clear evidence that one is more accurate or has better predictive power based on validation.
It really puts the onus on the user to be skeptical then. A bit of a buyer beware situation in this category.
Very much so.
Okay, let's move into the next area. Technologies for monitoring psychological stress and evaluating cognitive function. There's definitely growing scientific interest in that link, right? Between the physiological and the psychological.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where biofeedback principles really come to the forefront. Using tech to give you feedback on your physiological state, especially how it relates to your emotions or your cognitive load. The idea is it can help you become more aware of your body's responses.
And maybe learn to control them.
Potentially, yes. Learn to modify those responses, maybe better understand your own motivation, or even aid in emotional or cognitive development.
And the applications seem obvious. Monitoring stress in really high-pressure jobs, military, medical emergency services, air traffic control.
Or even in competitive sports, where we know psychological stress, that choking under pressure idea, can massively impact performance.
So what specific devices or apps did the review mention here?
Well, there was the Omega Wave. It collects objective physiological data like ECG for cardiac stress and something called DC potential, which relates to central nervous system activity. It aims to give data on various functional systems in the body.
Okay. But were there caveats?
Big ones. The review pointed out significant limitations. The data it provides on things like energy supply or hormonal function, those aren't directly measured, they're inferred, maybe, which makes the validity of those specific insights pretty uncertain.
And the validation status.
Same story, really. Similar to many of the training apps, the review stated no validation or reliability stated for the Omega Wave device itself. Okay, what else?
There was the Feel wristband, designed to monitor emotions, offer training for emotional regulation using real-time vibration feedback. Connects to an app, cloud storage.
Sounds interesting.
It does. But at the time of the review, it wasn't actually commercially available yet, and again, no validation or reliability was stated. And the review raised a really smart question about devices like this.
If you're wearing it continuously, how does it tell the difference between the physiological signals related to psychological stress when you're just sitting there versus the signals related to the physical stress of, say, walking upstairs or exercising? That's a really tricky data interpretation challenge.
That's a very good point. Disentangling those signals must be hard.
Very hard. Other devices mentioned included my Calm Beat, that's a non-wearable pulse meter, uses a finger sensor to help you assess and train your breathing rate for emotional control. And the CoreSense HRV monitor, a portable finger device, aimed more at athletes using heart rate variability, HRV.
We talked about HRV earlier, the variation between heartbeats.
Right, using HRV to guide training readiness and fatigue. For both my Calm Beat and CoreSense, the review listed no validation or reliability stated. CoreSense was also noted as future availability at the time, and the source specifically questioned how the data from these finger-based devices, which use photoplethysmography or PPG.
Like the light sensor on many watches.
Exactly. How that PPG data compares to the more direct electrical measurement of the heart, the ECG, used by something like the omega wave. It's a fair question about data quality.
Okay, now what about EEG and cognitive function? Using brainwaves, electroencephalography. These devices and apps are aimed at assessing or maybe training cognitive skills. They often sound quite high-tech.
They often involve highly engineered hardware, yeah. But it's important to frame this correctly. While a specific consumer device might lack validation against a gold standard, the broader scientific literature does actually provide support for the concept of using biofeedback, including EEG biofeedback, to help reduce stress and anxiety. There's research behind the principle.
Okay, so the underlying science has some backing. But the question is whether this particular gadget implements it accurately and effectively.
Precisely. That's the critical distinction. The Muse device by Interaxon was mentioned. It's an independent EEG biofeedback device, can be paired with other systems. The review highlighted its focus on EEG measurement. But, let me guess. You got it. The review stated no validation or reliability for Muse itself, although some systems it could be coupled with were listed as commercially available.
Right. Another example.
NeuroTracker. This was presented as task-based computer software, also a mobile app. It's based on multiple object tracking, a concept used in cognitive science research for, 30 years.
Okay, so based on established research paradigms.
Yes. It's been developed as a training tool targeting attention, working memory, visual processing speed. Potential uses mentioned were for athletes, maybe concussion recovery, or helping older adults with motion perception. But again, the review stated no validation or reliability for NeuroTracker as a whole product.
It's a persistent pattern. Were there other task-based apps mentioned for cognitive assessment?
Several. T2 Mood Tracker, for instance, designed to monitor and track emotional health, anxiety, depression, stress, PTSD, general well-being. Customizable, shows graphs. Again, no validation or reliability stated.
Okay, but wasn't there one that did have validation mentioned?
Yes, you're right. Contrast that with the King Divic Test mobile app. This one stood out because it was explicitly listed as validated and reliable, yes, in the review.
What does it do?
It tests a cognitive function by looking at eye movements. It's often used for baseline screening and then potentially reassessing after a suspected concussion.
And the review gave details on its validation.
Strong details. It said it's been tested extensively in clinics and on the field, described as proven, easy to use, reliable, valid, sensitive, accurate. Crucially, you don't need medical training to administer it, so it's practical for sideline use.
Any specific studies cited?
Yes, the source mentioned validation studies showing impaired performance on the test correlated strongly with clinical concussion severity measures in boxers. Other studies showed performance deficits after concussion in American football, rugby league players, and even combat soldiers. So this one really stands out in the sources as having a substantial evidence base backing its claims.
That's a significant difference compared to the others.
It really is. In contrast, other apps in this category had less evidence presented. Hit check tests, memory, balance, coordination, etc., listed with no validation or reliability stated. Brain Check Sport uses common cognitive tests like flanker, Stroop, trail making to assess attention, memory, reaction time, noted as not independently validated.
What about BrainFix? Assessing mild brain disorders.
That one requires assessor training, measures up to 30 cognitive skills, including mood, social function, balance, fine motor, but also listed with no validation or reliability stated.
And Sway, the balance and reaction time app.
Sway was listed as validated, yes, for its balance measurements, but explicitly only in small studies. It did show correlations with established balance tools like the BSS and Biodex system. However, no reliability was stated, and it also needs baseline screening.
And there was a catch with sway, wasn't there?
Yes, a critical potential issue highlighted was the risk of intentional underperformance during the baseline test. Someone could deliberately do poorly when healthy.
To make a post-injury score look better by comparison.
Exactly. Allowing them to potentially return to play too soon, that's not a tech flaw, but a human factor messing with the data integrity. And finally, HeadSmart computer software for reaction time, memory, attention. Also, no validation or reliability stated, baseline recommended. So yeah, for cognitive assessment apps in these sources, Kingdevik seems to be the clear frontrunner in terms of published evidence.
Okay, let's switch to sleep. Monitoring and promoting sleep. This feels like another huge market segment. Loads of wearables claim to track sleep.
Huge segment. And the good news here, according to the review, is that compared to some other categories we've discussed, several of these sleep tracking devices have actually been subjected to validation studies, and they're compared against the gold standard.
Which is?
Polysomnography, or PSG, that's a comprehensive sleep study done in a lab with electrodes measuring brain waves, EEG, eye movements, EOG, muscle activity, EMG, heart rhythm, ECG, breathing, oxygen levels, the works.
Okay, so comparing against the lab standard gives a much stronger basis for evaluation.
Definitely. But the validation results aren't always perfect. They often highlight specific limitations of the wearables. For example, the UP wristband was validated against PSG. It showed high sensitivity for detecting sleep, meaning it's good at knowing when you are asleep.
Sensitivity, got it, like 97%.
Yeah, MEL 0.97.
Wow.
Very good. But it had low specificity for detecting wakefulness during the sleep period, only 0.37.
Low specificity, meaning?
Meaning it's not very good at identifying when you're actually awake, but lying still in bed during the night.
Ah, okay, so it might think you're sleeping when you're just lying there awake.
Exactly. And the source noted this leads to it overestimating total sleep time by about 26 minutes on average, and how long it takes you to fall asleep, sleep onset latency, by about 5 minutes. And conversely, it underestimates the time you spend awake during the night after falling asleep, wake after sleep onset, by about 31 minutes.
So even though it correlates reasonably well with total sleep time and time in bed,
Right, those correlations were okay, like R always 6.3 and R always 7.9.
it doesn't correlate well with that wake after sleep onset time. So validated, yes, but with these known biases you need to be aware of.
Precisely. You need to know what the numbers actually mean and what their limitations are. The popular Fitbit devices, Flex and Charge 2 were also mentioned. They track total sleep time, time in bed. The Charge 2 was listed as validated, yes. Flex also, yes.
Okay, good.
But, slightly confusingly, the review's summary table listed the reliability testing status as no for both of them.
Huh. Validated but not reliable. How does that work?
It's a bit unclear from the summary. It could mean maybe a single validation study was done comparing it to PSG once, but maybe repeated measurements aren't consistent day to day.
Okay.
Or perhaps reliability just wasn't specifically assessed or reported in the cited validation study. It really highlights how important the details are behind that validated label.
Yeah, that's a crucial point for anyone using these.
Yeah.
Is it a one-off comparison or is it consistently accurate? What about the OUA ring? Lots of people use that.
Our IA ring uses an accelerometer, gyroscope, and heart rate data to estimate light, deep, and REM sleep. It was also listed as validated, yes. But similar to the Fitbits, the table listed reliability as no.
Same potential ambiguity then.
Seems like it. Other devices mentioned included the Dream Headband, which uses miniaturized EEG sensors, that's interesting, using brain waves directly, and the Plex sleep scanner, a chest strap. For both of those, the review stated no validation or reliability stated.
Okay. What about Sleep Profiler PSG2? That sounds like it uses PSG tech.
It's mentioned as an EEG-based sleep monitor providing detailed sleep stage data. The validation status wasn't explicitly provided in the summary table for that specific device, although using frontal EEG is certainly closer to the PSG standard.
The source also mentioned non-contact devices, like things you put under the mattress.
Yeah, like the bed at 3. For those, it's often less clear exactly how they're deriving sleep stages or breathing patterns remotely. Some monitor ambient things, though, like room temperature, noise, light levels, which we know can affect sleep quality.
So for sleep trackers, the takeaway seems to be validation against the gold standard PSG is more common than in some other areas, which is good.
But the results vary. And understanding the specific limitations and biases found in those validation studies, like overestimating sleep time or being poor at detecting wakefulness, is absolutely key to interpreting the data correctly. And that distinction between validity, accuracy, and reliability, consistency, isn't always clearly established or reported for consumer devices.
Right. Okay, final specific application area. Devices and apps for evaluating concussion. Given how common concussions are sports, combat, workplace accidents, falls along, there's a massive need for simple, objective, reliable ways to evaluate them and monitor recovery.
Absolutely. Having validated tools here could be incredibly valuable for everyone involved: team doctors, trainers, the athletes themselves, parents.
And the King-Devick test app came up again here, didn't it? Specifically for monitoring eye movements and cognitive function related to concussion.
It did. And as we discussed under cognitive function, the evidence base presented for King-Devick in these sources seems relatively strong compared to others mentioned.
Remind us of the key points on its validation.
Tested extensively, yes. Reliable, yes. Valid, yes. Requires baseline screening. The review reiterated it's proven easy to use, reliable, valid, sensitive, accurate, and suitable for field use because it doesn't require medical training to administer. The validation studies cited showed it could detect performance impairments post-concussion and that those impairments correlated with clinical severity measures.
So King-Devick is presented in these sources as an example of a technology in this really sensitive area that has undergone significant independent testing and has published evidence to back it up.
That seems to be the case based on this review. Other tools mentioned showed less supporting evidence presented. The iSync device, using an eye movement test, was listed as not commercially available and not validated at the time of the review.
BrainCheck Sport, the app using various cognitive tests.
Mentioned again, noted it's being quick, but the review reiterated it's not independently validated.
And Sway, the balance and reaction app.
Appeared again, too. Balance measurements listed as validated, yes, but only in small studies. Reliability stated as no. And that critical caveat about the potential for deliberately messing up the baseline test.
Right, the sandbagging issue.
Yeah.
What about sensors detecting impacts?
The CSX was mentioned, a microsensor that detects linear and rotational acceleration forces on the head during collisions connected to an app, listed with no validation or reliability stated.
So the landscape for concussion tech seems similar to the others we've discussed. Lots of emerging technology, lots of potential.
But for many of them, the rigorous, independent evidence base needed to really confirm their reliability and validity is still developing, or maybe it just hasn't been published. With King-Devick being presented here as a notable exception, with more expensive support documented in these sources.
Okay, this brings us right back, doesn't it, to the critical, overarching challenge we've seen threaded through pretty much every category: validation. The core finding, the inescapable conclusion from that major research review we looked at, is that while so much of this tech comes from genuine real-world needs and often uses promising scientific principles, only a remarkably small proportion of the commercially available devices and apps have actually been proven effective through rigorous, independent scientific validation.
That pattern is arguably the single most significant takeaway from that whole review section. They even showed it visually. Figure 3 in that source was a pie chart breaking down the tech based on validation status. And the biggest slice of that pie, the dominant slice representing the market reality, unequivocally labeled not validated.
Not validated. That's stark. Then there was another big chunk.
Right, a substantial segment classified as based on solid science but not validated, which perfectly highlights the gap, doesn't it? The underlying scientific idea might be sound, but whether this specific product's implementation of that idea is accurate and reliable, that hasn't been independently tested against an accepted standard.
And those two slices, not validated and based on solid science but not validated, they dwarf the others.
Oh, yeah. Compare those huge portions to the much smaller segments representing technologies that are actually classified as validated or specifically used in research, or where the same general class of device used in research has been validated. It really emphasizes that independent scientific validation done by researchers not tied to the company, published in peer-reviewed journals, that provides the strongest level of support for a technology's claims and accuracy.
So, given that reality, why is this rigorous testing so often missing? The source suggested a few reasons. One is just the difficulty sometimes in agreeing on a single gold standard for comparison, especially for complex things like cognitive function or stress.
Which involve multiple body systems and vary so much between individuals.
Right. What else?
Another very practical reason is just cost and time. running rigorous independent validation studies across multiple sites. That takes serious money and a lot of time designing it, running it, analyzing it, getting it published. That can be a real barrier, especially for smaller companies, or maybe ones just trying to get to market fast.
And let's be honest, the review also hinted at maybe a less flattering reason.
Yeah, it did suggest the possibility that some companies might actually want to avoid independent testing and public scrutiny about their product's validity. Maybe if they aren't entirely confident, it will stack up well against established standards.
Okay, so given this landscape where validation is often lacking, the authors of that review proposed a more nuanced way to think about the evidence, didn't they?
They did. They suggested looking at technologies regularly used in academic research. The idea being, even if a specific commercial product hasn't undergone formal validation itself, if researchers are consistently using that type of device or platform in their published studies, that might suggest it provides reliable enough data. Researchers, presumably, wouldn't keep using tools they didn't trust, so maybe those could be considered well supported.
They had that rainbow visual, right?
Yeah.
Showing a spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. A visual showing strength of evidence correlating with effectiveness, classifying tech along a range, undetermined, emerging, promising, supported, and well supported.
And where did they think most of the tech they reviewed actually falls on that spectrum?
Based on their findings, they concluded that most of the technologies likely fall into the emerging or promising categories. Why? Precisely because of that widespread lack of rigorous published testing.
This whole picture, it fundamentally shifts the burden, doesn't it, onto the user, the consumer.
Absolutely.
It means that for you listening to this, just seeing a device marketed with amazing claims or fancy features, that's just not enough. The source really emphasizes this advice. Before you buy, you need to carefully consider if the technology is likely to be genuinely useful and effective based on the strength of the supporting evidence that you can actually find, publicly available evidence, not just relying on the marketing spin or the company's own website claims.
And beyond that crucial validation question, the review also brought up other practical things for users to think about, like, does the device need regular calibration to stay accurate? Do you need specialist training either to operate it properly or just to understand the complex data it might give you?
How portable is it? What's the range for sending signals? Does it use standard connections like Bluetooth or ANT Plus so it can talk to other systems? What about data storage? Is it secure? How much can it hold?
Right. These are all factors that can really impact your day-to-day experience, how well it integrates with other tools you use, and ultimately, how practically useful the device actually is in your life or your work, even separate from its core accuracy.
Okay, let's focus in now specifically on biofeedback. It's such a fascinating mind-body technique, and it seems to underpin a lot of these technologies we're talking about. The Miendi source we looked at had a really clear explanation.
It did. It described biofeedback as essentially a training method. It helps you learn to self-regulate, to gain conscious control over bodily functions that are normally pretty involuntary.
Like heart rate, muscle tension.
Exactly. Heart rate, muscle tension, skin temperature, breathing patterns, all these things change significantly, often without you even noticing when you feel anxious or stressed or even just really focused.
So the core idea is use technology to track these signals, like maybe heart rate variability or brain activity. Give the person real-time feedback.
And that feedback helps you become more aware of how your body is responding in different situations. Then, that awareness allows you to practice techniques to intentionally influence those responses. You're essentially training your mind to better manage your body's reactions to stress or maybe improve your cognitive focus.
Okay, so tracking the signals helps you recognize and manage the stress response as it's happening.
Yes. And the menu source listed various types of home biofeedback devices and the tech they use for that feedback and training. Things like HRV monitors, EEG headsets measuring brain waves, PPG sensors, the light-based ones on fingers or wrists, even simple stress thermometers that monitor skin temperature, which tends to drop when you're stressed.
And it specifically mentioned FNIRS technology too, didn't it? Functional near-infrared spectroscopy.
It did. Similar to the NIRS we talked about for muscle oxygen, but this is applied to the brain, typically the prefrontal cortex.
The part involved in focus and emotional control.
Right. It measures changes in blood flow and oxygenation there. The goal is to help users improve cognitive function, reduce anxiety, enhance stress management by basically training themselves to increase activity in that brain region using the FNIRS feedback.
What devices were mentioned using these different techs?
Well, Miendi itself uses FNIRS. Muse uses EEG. HeartMath Inner Balance uses HRV. Others mentioned were Apollo Neuro, Leaf Smart Patch, Resprit, that one focuses on guided breathing to influence HRV, and Reflect Orb.
Now, the Mandy source also included some really important warnings, especially for people thinking about using these for something serious like anxiety.
Yes, very important caveats. It's strongly advised talking to a doctor first, making sure biofeedback tech is appropriate for you and fits with your overall mental health plan.
And it touched on the validation issue again.
It did. It echoed that point, noting that consumer devices might not have the same accuracy as clinical-grade equipment, which could mean inconsistent readings or unreliable feedback, potentially hindering the training process. It really reinforces why knowing if a device is validated matters for effectiveness.
And it positioned biofeedback not as a cure-all, but as
A complementary training tool. That was the key phrase. It's most effective when used alongside other established approaches: therapy, lifestyle changes, mindfulness practices.
So it's a tool to boost your existing strategies, not necessarily replace them.
Exactly. And like learning meditation or starting exercise, which the source compared it to biofeedback, requires motivation, consistent practice, and patience to really see results. The tech gives you the info, but you still have to put in the work.
Building on that, one source, the IRIS paper, gave us a fascinating look at a specific research project. They were evaluating an integrated system of wearable sensors for monitoring stress, specifically in demanding work environments. And crucially, they used biological markers to validate the data from the wearables.
Biological markers for validation. That ties right back to our main theme, needing objective proof that the tech is actually capturing real physiological changes.
Precisely. So how did the study define stress biologically?
They defined it as a real or even just an anticipated disruption of homeostasis. The body's stable internal balance, a threat to our physiological integrity. This kicks off an alarm reaction in key brain areas: hippocampus, amygdala involved in fear motion, prefrontal cortex involved in control.
And that brain activity triggers body-wide responses.
Yep. There's the rapid response via the sympathetic adrenal medullary, or SAM axis. That's your classic fight or flight adrenaline, noradrenaline release. Then there's the slower, more sustained response via the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal. That leads to cortisol release.
Cortisol, the stress hormone.
Right. Increased cortisol helps raise blood sugar, giving you energy to deal with the perceived threat. And the study used salivary cortisol as its validation measure.
Why salivary cortisol?
Because it's widely considered a reliable biological marker of stress. It reflects the activity of that HPA axis over time. So the researchers thought, okay, if our wearable sensors are accurately picking up stress-related physiological changes, those changes should track along with the changes we see in salivary cortisol levels.
Makes sense. How did they actually stress people out in the lab for the study?
They used something called the Maastricht Acute Stress Test, or MAST test. It's a standard, non-invasive procedure known to reliably trigger responses from both the fast SAM axis and the slower HPA axis, including those measurable cortisol increases.
What does the F-TER test involve?
It involves participants alternating between two tasks. One is cold pressure stress, plunging a hand into really cold water, like 5 degrees Celsius.
Ouch.
Yeah. The other is demanding mental arithmetic, like counting backwards rapidly from a big number, say 2043, in big, awkward steps, like 17s, and they get negative feedback, told they're too slow, which adds to the stress.
That definitely sounds stressful.
It's designed to be. And while people went through this MS test, and also during control relaxation periods, the researchers collected saliva samples at specific times right before the stress, immediately after, and then 10, 30, and 40 minutes later so they could track the cortisol levels over time.
And at the same time, the wearables were recording physiological data.
Exactly. The sensor system measured heart rate variability, HRV, electrodermal activity, EDA, and electroencephalography, EEG.
So HRV for heart rhythm patterns reflecting nervous system activity.
Right. Metrics like SDNN, RMSSD, PNN50.
EDA for skin conductance, basically sweating, showing sympathetic arousal.
Yeah, looking at things like startle response features.
And EEG for brain activity, like attention or meditation indices, or specific brainwave power like alpha waves.
Yep. They processed all these raw signals, filtered them, extracted specific features from the data streams, and then came the crucial comparison.
What did they find? Did the wearable data match the cortisol changes?
That was the key finding. Yes, they found that the physiological changes recorded by the wearable sensors did significantly correlate with the changes in salivary cortisol concentration measured over the course of the MS test. They identified 22 specific parameters drawn from HRV, EDA, and EEG signals that showed statistically significant differences between the relaxed state and the stress condition.
Okay, so this wasn't just random noise the sensors were picking up. The study showed that changes measured by the wearables were effectively linked to the stress induced by the test, and that link was backed up by changes in a reliable biological marker, cortisol.
Exactly right. That's the real significance. The authors presented it as a promising pilot study. It demonstrated the feasibility of using this kind of integrated wearable system to detect and monitor stress. And the crucial part was providing that level of validation, showing the wearable signals tracked with changes in a recognized biological standard for the stress response.
That proof of concept validation seems like a really important step towards real-world use. What did the authors suggest as next steps?
Well, they suggested more work is needed to refine the algorithms that process the data, to test their stress detection models in more realistic settings outside the lab, like actual workplaces. And ultimately, the goal is to translate these algorithms so they can run efficiently on portable, wearable devices themselves, providing real-time stress feedback directly to the user.
And the purpose of that real-time feedback?
The ultimate aim is prevention and management, using that real-time insight to help people manage chronic stress and hopefully avoid some of the negative health consequences associated with it.
That vision of real-time, validated stress feedback from a wearable. That's really compelling. Okay, let's shift gears slightly again and look at wearables specifically for biofeedback in physical rehabilitation. We have a systematic review and meta-analysis from PubMed Central that looked at wearable devices-based biofeedback rehabilitation, or WDBR, particularly in people with neurological conditions like Parkinson's, stroke, or mild cognitive impairment.
Right. This review looked at how wearables are being used to give feedback on biomechanical things like movement or physiological things like muscle activity, with the aim of improving outcomes, especially balance and gait in people with these neurological diseases, PWND as they called them.
And the thinking behind it.
The idea is that giving patients immediate feedback on how they're moving or how their muscles are working can maybe enhance motor learning, help them relearn movements better, and also keep them more engaged in their rehab exercises.
What kinds of sensors were commonly used in the studies they reviewed?
They found two main types: biomechanical sensors, focused on movement and force, and physiological sensors.
Okay, what are the biomechanical ones?
Those included IMU's inertial measurement units. They combine accelerometers, gyroscopes, sometimes magnetometers, to track orientation, movement, acceleration, often placed on the legs or trunk to monitor things like body sway or limb movement. Pressure sensors were also common, frequently put under the foot, especially the weaker leg after a stroke, to give feedback on weight bearing, sometimes in shoes or even built into canes. And electrogoniometers were used too, measuring joint angles, again, usually on the lower limbs, for feedback on range of motion.
And the physiological sensors used in these rehab studies?
The review mentioned EMG sensors, electromyography, measuring electrical activity in muscles, placed on relevant muscles like those in the lower leg, maybe to help patients learn to activate or relax them correctly. And EEG sensors, electroencephalography on the head, measuring brain signals, potentially for neurofeedback to influence brain activity related to movement control.
How was the actual biofeedback delivered during the rehab sessions?
Mostly in real time, the review found, during the exercises. The feedback was commonly auditory, like sounds or tones or visual, maybe displayed on a screen, and it often used a positive reinforcement strategy, meaning the feedback would signal when the patient was doing the movement correctly, meeting the target or threshold set by the therapist, like a good job signal.
The rehab programs themselves varied quite a bit, didn't they?
Yeah.
In terms of length, sessions.
Yeah, quite a lot. Training periods ranged from maybe 10 to 30 sessions, spread over up to 2 months. Session times also varied widely, from 20 minutes up to 90 minutes.
And how did therapists make the exercises harder as patients improved?
They progress things in different ways, maybe adjusting the complexity of the task, changing the target values the patient was aiming for, increasing walking time or speed, or adjusting the biofeedback thresholds, like making the criteria for getting that positive feedback stricter as the patient got better.
Okay, so they adapted the training.
Yeah.
Now, the big question, what did the meta-analysis actually conclude about the effectiveness of this WDBR approach in neurological rehab?
Well, they did pool the results from multiple studies in a meta-analysis, but they included a really important note of caution. They said the results need to be interpreted very carefully.
Why the caution?
Because there were significant differences in the methods used across the studies, the types of patients included, and also concerns about the overall quality of the studies.
Right, that sounds like a common issue when reviewing emerging fields or technologies.
It really is. So their overall finding on effectiveness was that firm, definitive conclusions were not possible across the board for all people with neurological diseases. Just too much variation, methodological, clinical, high variability in results, and frankly, not enough high-quality studies to draw strong, generalizable conclusions yet.
Okay, so no sweeping statement that it works for everyone. But were there any hints or specific areas where it looked promising?
Yes. While they couldn't make a firm conclusion overall, the review did suggest that WDBR appears to provide positive effects on dynamic balance and gait for people with neurological diseases. So, a promising signal, but not definitively proven by this body of evidence.
Was there any specific subgroup where the results were stronger, more statistically significant?
Yes, they did a subgroup analysis focusing just on studies involving stroke patients who were using pressure sensors, getting auditory biofeedback. And that analysis did show statistically significant positive effects, specifically on improving gait speed, compared to control groups who didn't get that feedback.
Gait speed. Is the improvement they saw considered meaningful in a clinical sense?
Yes, that was important. The average improvement in gait speed in that specific stroke subgroup actually exceeded 0.1 meters per second. And in stroke rehab, an increase of 0.1 meters is widely considered the minimal clinically important change, or MCIC.
MCIC, the smallest change that actually matters to a patient's daily life function.
Exactly. So for this very specific application, stroke patients, pressure sensors, auditory feedback for gait speed, the evidence, although based on just 4 studies in that subgroup, suggests a clinically relevant positive effect.
Okay, that's a more concrete positive finding. But what about the overall quality challenges in the literature? What biases did they find?
The review highlighted a high prevalence of what's termed unclear risk of bias across most studies in several key areas. This means there were potential flaws in how the studies were designed or run that could skew the results.
Like what kind of flaws?
Issues in how participants were selected or assigned to groups, selection bias, concerns about whether participants, therapists, or the people assessing outcomes knew who was getting the biofeedback. Performance and detection bias, hard to avoid with biofeedback but needs careful handling. Problems with how missing data was dealt with, attrition bias, and potential issues with whether all the results measured were actually reported, reporting bias. This high chance of bias makes it really hard to be confident in the findings.
So even with some promising signals, like for gait speed and stroke, the underlying research quality is a major hurdle for drawing strong conclusions. What do they recommend for future research?
2 main things. First, a need for comparative studies. Studies that directly compare different types of feedback, different sensor setups, different strategies to figure out what works best for specific conditions and patient groups. What helps a Parkinson's patient might differ from what helps a stroke patient.
Makes sense. And the second thing,
Fundamentally, they called for higher quality randomized controlled trials, RCTs, with larger sample sizes. That's really essential to reduce that risk of bias, give the studies enough power to detect real effects if they exist, and make the findings more generalizable, allowing for much more robust and definitive conclusions about whether, how, and for whom WDBR is truly effective in neurological rehab.
okay, let's shift now to the market side of things, because this tech isn't just in labs or clinics, it's a big growing business. The biofeedback instrument market is pretty substantial.
Oh yeah, it holds a significant share globally, and it's seeing really consistent, strong growth. According to one source, the global market was valued around $213 million back in 2023, and it's projected to reach something like $303 million by 2030.
That's pretty healthy growth. And the demand signals looked even stronger.
Yeah, projections talking about a potential 57, nearly 58% increase in demand by 2033. And almost 50% demand increase just in the past year alone. That's huge growth.
What's driving that expansion?
It seems to be a few key things converging. There's definitely hospitals actually account for the biggest slice, roughly 52 to 54%. The main focus there seems to be on neurological and cardiovascular disorders. And there's noted growth specifically in using EEG-based and sweat gland, or ED biofeedback in psychiatric departments.
What about home use? That feels like a big growth area.
It is. Home use is a major and rapidly expanding segment, making up about 30 to 35% of the market. This is really where consumer adoption is taking off, driven by interest in stress management, self-tracking health, performance enhancement. Wearable systems are obviously key here. And interestingly, brainwave biofeedback, often via those EEG headsets we talked about, though validation varies, that seems to dominate the home use segment, around 48–49% share within home use. Clinics practices outside hospitals make up about 19%. They're mainly using biofeedback for rehabilitation and pain management. EMG-based biofeedback for muscle control and temperature biofeedback have seen notable growth in that clinic sector.
And regionally, where's the biggest market?
North America currently dominates, holding around 40%, maybe 38.5% market share. That's put down to advanced healthcare infrastructure, high mental health awareness, consumers willing to adopt tech. The U.S. leads the region by far, but Canada and Mexico are also growing significantly, helped by government investment in digital health and expanding wellness and sports therapy markets. And integrating biofeedback into telehealth platforms, that's surging across North America, boosting accessibility.
Europe is second.
Second largest, yeah, around 27.5 to 29.3% share, helped by supportive regulations for digital health tech. But the fastest growing region highlighted is Asia Pacific, already holding around 32% share, but with a projected demand increase of a massive 42.6%.
Wow. Who's leading in Asia Pacific?
China is a major player, leading the region partly due to its huge manufacturing capacity for affordable devices, and also applying these techs, sometimes blending them with traditional medicine. Japan shows high adoption of EEG and HRV biofeedback, especially for neurological treatments. India is seeing a huge surge in usage, driven by rising mental health awareness and telemedicine growth. South Korea is notable for integrating AI rapidly into biofeedback tech. Australia is growing in sports science and rehab, and Southeast Asian nations are increasing adoption too.
And the home use market is expanding fast there as well.
Definitely. The penetration of portable biofeedback devices into homes is really taking off across Asia Pacific, making self-regulated therapy and health insights much more accessible to a huge population.
Did the reports mention key companies?
Yeah, some top players by market share were mentioned, like Thought Technology Ltd. Holding a pretty significant share, around 32.5%, and Mind Media BV with about 21.3%.
So overall, the market analysis confirms this is a sector with substantial growth and attracting significant investment.
Absolutely. It reflects growing confidence in the potential of biofeedback and wearable technologies, despite the validation gaps we've discussed for some areas.
And this market momentum, it links directly to where the tech might go next.
Yeah.
Integrating more sophisticated AI, machine learning.
Exactly. The plan is clearly to use those algorithms to enhance diagnostic capabilities, maybe letting devices spot subtle physiological or cognitive patterns that are really hard for a human to see in the raw data.
And you mentioned continuous monitoring earlier too, like with ECG.
Yeah, there's active exploration into using wearable ECG devices for continuous monitoring, not just spot checks. Imagine catching intermittent heart arrhythmias that might be missed in a short doctor's visit because the wearable catches it over days or weeks. This points towards a bigger vision.
Rated healthcare.
Exactly, where different machines and devices talk to each other seamlessly. Remember that low-cost ECG machine research, relaying data to a server for a doctor. Now, expand that idea. The balance and gait data from wearables in rehab or the stress and HRV data from your work wearable, all potentially flowing securely to clinicians or into personalized health platforms for really comprehensive long-term monitoring and intervention.
The technology is definitely pushing towards more capability, deeper integration, potentially of a much bigger impact on how we manage health.
It is. But as we've seen throughout this deep dive, the pace of that technological innovation is currently way out ahead of the pace of rigorous, independent scientific validation, especially for many of the direct-to-consumer applications. That gap remains a critical challenge.
So we've taken quite a journey here. We've gone from those now common step-counting wristbands all the way to sophisticated sensors, complex algorithms trying to measure everything from muscle oxygen to brainwaves. We've seen how biofeedback principles are being applied in so many different ways: stress, sleep, cognition, even physical rehab.
And along the way, we've really unpacked what the sources are telling us. We've highlighted the incredible potential here, the sheer diversity of applications emerging, the absolutely crucial role of biological markers in actually validating the physiological data, the promising but still often developing use in clinical settings like rehab, the undeniable market growth.
And running right through the middle of it all, that vital, persistent question: independent scientific validation. What's the real evidence behind the claims these devices are making?
And understanding those nuances, that whole spectrum of evidence, is just essential for you, the listener, as you try to navigate this really complex space. It's the key, hopefully, to cutting through some of the marketing hype and spotting where the genuine evidence-based insights and potentially useful applications actually lie.
So, thinking about that wide spectrum of evidence we've discussed today, from something like the King-Divic test, presented as well-supported and validated against standards, or sleep trackers validated against PSG but with known limitations, all the way down to so many consumer devices and apps, where the reliability is basically undetermined because companies haven't published or maybe haven't even done the independent validation. How does your responsibility shift when you choose to use these technologies for insights into your own health, your fitness, your mental state?
Yeah, how can you move beyond just, looking at the number on the screen and taking it as gospel? What steps can you take to become a more critical evaluator of the data these devices provide? What questions should you be asking, maybe asking yourself or asking the companies making these things to make sure you're making truly informed choices about the technology you're relying on for insights into your own body and mind? It's a really vital consideration, isn't it, as these devices become more and more woven into the fabric of our personal health journeys?